Hi there, my name's Ed, and today we're going to talk about something slightly different. We're going to be talking about anosmia and ageusia, which is associated with this global virus that we've got on at the moment. And I thought I'd talk about this because it's actually something I experienced myself, a symptom I experienced as a result of being positive with COVID. And it was quite an interesting experience being having anosmia while also having quite a strong passion for tasting and tastes and flavours and all of those things. And I thought initially that COVID just gave you anosmia, so loss of smell. And of course, we know that smell essentially is very much associated with flavour. So all of the kind of aromatics and flavours that you might taste in something are due to your smell. The kind of retronasal olfaction, when it goes kind of from your mouth back out your nose, that's usually what you're sort of actually experiencing as taste. And then of course you've got stuff like the experience of saltiness and acidity, which you get in your mouth, in your tongue, kind of lower down into your throat as well, which we get with different teas, different astringency and dryness as well we can experience. But COVID actually can contribute to both, or a loss of both, I should say. So anosmia, loss of smell, and ageusia, loss of taste. And it's not a trivial symptom. In fact, it's become one of the what's known as cardinal symptoms in COVID. Sounds like cardinal sin. But this is a symptom which is used to identify or kind of diagnose somebody more readily, because other symptoms are quite common. For example, fatigue, headache. These sort of things are experienced in a large majority of cases. However, you might get a headache for any number of reasons. So loss of smell and taste is quite unique to COVID. So it's become quite an important factor. Although we relatively don't know much about it still. We don't know about the mechanism of why this happens particularly. There's still very much a lot of debate going around about this, and I can see why, because firstly because it's probably the lesser importance. It's not going to cause you any significant health impacts particularly, and we're busy finding effective vaccines, etc. Better to look at that than to figure out why I can't smell my tea or my coffee in the morning. But another reason is that you can actually only figure out what's going on in terms of the cells and mechanisms and pathways, really from biopsies. So you actually have to analyze the human tissue and see what's going on. We can do this in kind of mice, and we can kind of, I think, do certain different sort of analytical techniques, but we actually do need those biopsies. So again, if you're going to be doing a biopsy, you're probably going to be looking at somebody's lungs, heart, etc. Not going to be looking at their nasal epithelium. But the interesting and worrying thing about anosmia in COVID is that some people don't make a full recovery, or at least it takes a long time to recover. I've seen in the stats that around 90% of people report a full recovery of smell, but some definitely have longer periods of recovery, lasting a number of months. And of course, this virus has only been around for a number of months, so we don't know about the long-term effect. But it can be a longer road to recovery than you might think. So it's bad in one way because it might last for a long time, but it's actually been very useful as an early factor, because many people only experience anosmia rather than other symptoms. So it's actually been a very good sort of early signalling or early diagnostic tool for doctors and national sort of governmental healthcare systems around the world. So there's good bits and there's bad bits. One interesting thing that I found was that not only did I lose a lot of my smell, essentially all of it. There's certain things that I could smell. For example, I could smell certain washing up detergents. I'm not sure why, but almost nothing else. In fact, it was green apple washing detergent, interestingly. You did experience a dampening in taste as well. So that ageusia symptom, which is much less talked about, I ended up putting lots of acidity into my food, lots of salt, much to probably people's sort of or against many people's recommendations to do so. But I like to taste things, and these two things can, amplify flavour in food. And I could barely even sense acidity. I could barely even sense saltiness. I remember having, one meal and only really being able to get a general sense that it was salty after adding lots and lots of salt. So I think what we taste when we taste saltiness is not just the salt itself, but how salt amplifies other flavours. So again, you're not tasting the flavour of salt, you're tasting how it affects other flavours. So adding lots of salt it almost had no impact. It didn't really give me much satisfaction in my food like I thought it might. And I did not really enjoy eating food. Mostly it was just a textural experience, which was far less pleasing than usual. And I mean, another quite interesting factor in this is that it's not congestive. So it's not that you can't smell because your nasal passage is blocked in any way. In fact, I could breathe very, very readily. There was absolutely no blockage in my nasal pathway. I just couldn't smell. So, the molecules were going in and no signals were being sent, essentially. And they have been looking into why this is. And they have found a link between the degeneration of both structural cells in your olfactory epithelium and also the cilia as well. So the little sort of finger-shaped cells that'll be in your nasal cavity, which essentially pick up or sense different chemicals. So they'll send a chemical signal to neurons, which then send signals to your brain to signal, what you're tasting. So there was actually degradation in the sensory cells, but also the structural cells as well. And these cells don't take very long to come back. Around 10 days, I think I've seen, is that sort of cell regeneration. But as we know, or as I've said, the loss of smell can last for much longer, and they don't actually know really why that happens. There is debate around the effect on neurons and the effect on the virus going into the brain, crossing the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And again, we're not 100% sure why or how the virus gets into the brain, the pathway that happens, and we're not sure on the effect on the sort of olfactory neurons that are sending these signals. So it's still very much uncharted territory as to why this is going on. So we can't really look to science really at the moment to explain or kind of figure out these problems. But one way I like to look at this as well is that the human body is very interesting, it's very dynamic, and there are many stories of through essentially what is pure will, rebuilding neurons, rebuilding nerves and different structures in the human body that have been damaged, where cells have been lost or senses have been lost. And one thing you can essentially do is practice smelling and kind of rebuild those pathways in your brain. And it kind of sounds silly, but practicing smell is something that might be useful to do. And it's been useful having quite nice aromatic Chinese tea to experiment with, because in your daily life you might smell things in passing, but it's almost like a marker of complexity and capacity. I can still sense that I lack a bit of a sense of my smell, which I wouldn't be able to if I didn't have a keen interest and a keen sense of a keen awareness of my own smell, or my sense of smell. And one example of this is actually a chef who got a sort of throat and tongue cancer, and he had his tongue removed, and he totally, I think due to the chemotherapy as well, he totally lost his sense of taste. It's totally wiped out, and he experienced essentially rebuilding his sense of taste. And over time, you know, sweet came back first, and then it's, you know, it slowly built up over time. But he then went on to win awards after losing, you know, the primary sense that you use as a chef. So even though we might be dealt, you know, a very bad hand, I mean, in his case, it was far worse than a case of COVID, for the average person, that is to say. But you may experience these things, but the human body is resilient, it's dynamic, it can rebuild, and he actually experienced taste in a different way than he had before. And he cites this as a reason for his success as a chef, because he built it from the ground up. He could sort of really analyse it and look at where his taste had sort of developed and how it was developing. And taste, as we kind of know, is something that is kind of built in a way. It's kind of something that we cultivate. So we get used to different tastes, and we grow to like different tastes due to exposure. So our palate is constantly changing, and obviously many people experience this, you know. I mean, one common example is, you know, when you're younger, you might be slightly fussier, you might not eat certain foods, and as you grow older, I suppose one reason for that is lower senses of smell as you age, but adding things to your diet which you didn't used to like, you know, acquiring tastes for things that might be bitter, or, you know, more challenging to the kind of a sort of newer palate. So I don't want to be disheartened by this kind of fluke symptom that we get with COVID. It doesn't necessarily make sense why we get it, why it happens, but not just because we don't really know, and we're not sure. We can still be kind of optimistic, and try and overcome this challenge with our, you know, in our own experience of taste. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm trying to sort of overcome that. I'm trying to look on the kind of the bright side of losing my smell. And of course, there's far worse things going on in the world. So it's good to have a bit of perspective and a bit of optimism. And there we are. That is my little video on experiencing anosmia.